August 3, 1943. Sicily was a furnace. The Mediterranean sun beat down on the 15th evacuation hospital like an angry hammer. Inside the canvas tent, the heat was unbearable, almost 100 degrees. The smell was thick and suffocating: iodine, sweat, and dried blood. Flies buzzed over stretchers. Men groaned in pain. The air was heavy, sticky, and almost impossible to breathe. Into this inferno walked General George S. Patton. Every step he took was precise, every movement deliberate. Polished helmet, riding breeches, ivory-handled revolvers glinting in the dim light. He looked like a god of war walking among mortals. The wounded soldiers watched him, their eyes wide, unsure if they were seeing salvation or terror. Patton moved slowly, stopping at a stretcher. He leaned down and asked the soldier lying there about his injury. The soldier, brave and proud, answered with determination. Patton smiled faintly. This was what he loved: the courage, the sacrifice, the raw human will to endure. The glow of pride seemed to shine in his eyes. Then he moved forward and the world shifted. He stopped at a supply box where a young soldier, Private Charles H. Cool, sat alone. No bandages. No blood. Just a young man, head down, trembling under the heat. Patton's shadow fell over him like a dark cloud swallowing the boy whole. "Where are you hurt?" Patton asked, his voice steady but commanding. The boy mumbled, barely audible. "My nerves, sir. I guess I just can't take it." For a moment, the tent fell into a silence so deep that the groans of the wounded seemed to vanish. The doctors froze mid-stitch. Nurses stopped moving. Every eye turned toward the general. Patton's face changed. The calm commander was gone. In its place was a storm, raw and terrifying. His eyes blazed. His jaw tightened. Every second stretched like eternity. Then, like a gunshot in the heat, his hand swung across the boy's face. The first slap echoed like thunder in the tent. Private Cool's helmet liner flew off, and his sobs filled the space. The sound was pure, raw fear, and it triggered something primal in Patton. He grabbed the boy by the collar, lifting him upright. His voice cracked, furious and commanding. "I won't have a yellow-bellied bastard sitting here crying," he roared. The tent held its breath. For one terrifying second, everyone thought the unthinkable. Patton might execute his own soldier right there. The hand on his ivory-handled revolver rested against his hip. Hearts pounded. Sweat ran down faces. Even the flies seemed to stop buzzing. Patton shoved the boy back down, his chest heaving. "You're going back to the front lines?" he screamed. "You may get shot and killed, but you're going to fight. If you don't, I'll stand you up against a wall and have a firing squad do it myself." The doctors, hands trembling, finally stepped forward. Colonel Donald Currier, senior in the medical staff, tried to intervene. Patton spun on him, furious. "Do not admit him. Throw him out," he barked. "There's no such thing as shell shock." His voice was sharp, unforgiving, a hammer crushing fragile nerves. The general stormed out of the tent, kicking a pile of discarded supplies as he left. The canvas flaps swung shut behind him. Silence returned. The heat returned. The flies returned. But the memory of the slap lingered like a shadow over everyone inside. Private Cool sat trembling, feverish and exhausted, barely able to breathe. Later he would be diagnosed with malaria, a fact that no one in the tent could have known in that moment. The horror and confusion were absolute. The greatest American general, a man of legendary courage and strategy, had just committed what could have been a career-ending crime in front of dozens of witnesses. But Patton did not stop there. That single violent moment would ripple far beyond the heat and blood of the Sicilian tent. Official reports would eventually carry the incident straight to the desk of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces. A man who wielded power with diplomacy, wisdom, and patience would soon face the storm of Patton's wrath, and a decision would need to be made that could change the course of the war. And for the men inside the tent that day, one thing was certain. No one would ever forget the sound of that first slap. It was more than punishment. It was fear, fury, and the raw, terrifying energy of a warrior who demanded perfection, no matter the cost. The war outside was brutal, but inside that tent, a single strike had frozen time, held hearts hostage, and set the stage for a story that would echo through history. And so it begins, the story of George S. Patton, a man as brilliant as he was terrifying, whose actions in Sicily would ignite a chain of events that could shake the very foundations of World War II. Just 1 week after the chaos in the first hospital tent, Sicily was hotter, dustier, and more dangerous. August 10, 1943. The 93rd Evacuation Hospital was sweltering, filled with soldiers who had survived gunfire, shells, and the chaos of a relentless campaign. Flies hovered, sweat ran down faces, and the metallic smell of blood mixed with antiseptic. The air seemed to hum with tension. General Georges Patton arrived, his polished boots crunching against the dry earth. He was the same god of war walking among men, charming and commanding at the same time. Cigarettes in hand, he smiled at some soldiers, handed out encouragement and asked about wounds. Nurses and doctors felt the familiar tension rise. Rumors of the first slap had spread through the ranks, whispers of fear and disbelief. Patton walked the line, eyes scanning, searching. Then he saw him, Private Paul G. Bennett. The boy trembled visibly, huddled on his cot. Eyes wide, staring at nothing. Patton approached slowly. The air shifted instantly. Everyone knew deep down what might happen. Memories of Private Cool, the first victim of Patton's wrath, lingered in the minds of all who had heard the story. "What's your trouble, son?" Patton asked, deceptively calm. Bennett's voice shook. "It's my nerves, sir. I can't stand the shelling anymore." He had watched his friend decapitated by an artillery shell days before. Sleep had fled him. His mind was cracking under the relentless pressure of modern warfare. Patton's face changed in an instant. Calm evaporated, replaced by a rage hotter than the Sicilian sun. "Your nerves? You yellow son of a..." The first slap landed. Art. The sound of leather on flesh echoed through the tent. Bennett's head snapped back, sobs spilling from his mouth. Patton's fury only grew. He slapped him again and again, each strike louder, more terrifying. The boy's helmet liner flew off. Nurses gasped. Doctors froze. Colonel Charles B. Eder, the hospital commander, watched in horror. He had seen what had happened last week. He wanted to intervene, but fear froze him. Patton's rage was a storm no one could stop. "You're going back to the front lines." Patton roared. "If you die, fine. But you will fight. If not, I'll see that a firing squad teaches you the lesson I already tried to." The revolver at his hip glinted in the sun. Silence fell over the hospital tent once more. Bennett, trembling, feverish and exhausted, had survived artillery and malaria only to face this unrelenting wrath. The medical staff could hardly believe what they were witnessing. This was supposed to be neutral ground, a place of healing, not a battlefield of fear and fury. Patton stormed out, leaving chaos behind. The heat, dust, and buzzing flies returned, but the tension lingered like smoke from a burning building. The soldiers who had witnessed the event would carry it in their minds forever. For them, the tent had become a place of terror as much as a place of care. The story of the second slap spread quickly. Rumors of Patton's brutality began to echo through the Allied forces. Officers whispered about Private Cool and now Private Bennett. Every report, every retelling grew louder. The tale reached the ears of higher command, moving like a fuse toward a massive explosion of consequences. At Allied headquarters, Dwight D. Eisenhower read the reports. Each word weighed heavy. Patton had violated military law. He had assaulted his own men. He had threatened execution. Yet Eisenhower knew something else. Patton was necessary. He was the spearhead, the force capable of driving the Germans back. Removing him could cost the Allies the war. The tension was unbearable. Eisenhower had to choose between justice and necessity, between following the law and preserving the ultimate goal, victory. He understood discipline, strategy, and the human cost of decisions in ways that few could. But Patton's actions pushed even his patience to the brink. And yet, Eisenhower did not immediately court-martial Patton. He decided on a more subtle, psychological approach. A private letter, delivered personally, would become the weapon to control a man as unpredictable as a hurricane. The letter was carefully written, cutting deeper than any slap. It questioned judgment, fairness, and leadership while preserving Patton's dignity enough to maintain his usefulness. Meanwhile, in Sicily, whispers spread to the soldiers, nurses, and officers. No one could forget the cries of Private Bennett, nor the terrifying sight of Patton, a living force of fury, standing over him. The hospital tents became a symbol, a small stage where the brutal paradox of Patton was revealed. Both savior and monster, both protector and tormentor. By the end of that day the stage was set. Patton's actions had created fear, tension, and a moral dilemma that would follow him to the very heart of Allied command. The war outside the tent raged, but inside, a different kind of battle was being fought, a battle over discipline, morality, and the limits of command. The second slap would not remain a secret. It was destined to reach the desk of the most powerful man in the Allied forces. And when it did, the decisions made there would determine not just Patton's future, but the course of the war itself. The tent was empty now, but the echoes remained, the sobs of a soldier, the thunder of a slap, and the shadow of a general whose rage was both feared and misunderstood. This was the brewing storm. And no one, not even Patton, could see how far it would reach. By mid-August 1943, the story of Patton's slaps had spread through Sicily like wildfire. Soldiers whispered in tents, nurses exchanged horrified glances, and officers debated in hushed tones. Private Charles Coole and Private Paul Bennett were no longer just men. They were symbols of a storm that had escaped the confines of a single hospital tent. At Allied headquarters in Algiers, General Dwight D. Eisenhower sat behind a massive desk, surrounded by maps, reports, and the weight of the war. The room was quiet except for the faint scratch of a pen on paper as aides scurried about. The reports of Patton's behavior lay on his desk, each one more shocking than the last. Threats, slaps, near executions. Eisenhower read them carefully, his brow furrowed. To any man, these actions were intolerable. Military law was clear: Patton had committed assault. Any ordinary soldier would have faced a court-martial, perhaps even prison. But Patton was no ordinary soldier. He was the American Army's sword, a warrior unmatched in courage, speed, and aggression. To lose him now could give the Germans an advantage they didn't deserve. Eisenhower leaned back in his chair, staring at the reports. The dilemma was brutal. If he punished Patton publicly, it would save principle but risk the war effort. If he ignored it, he would undermine justice and morality. Every second he considered, the pressure of history pressed down on him. He thought of Patton, the man who could strike terror into the enemy and inspire awe in his men. Patton had the ability to change battles overnight, yet he was reckless, unpredictable, and a danger to his own men. Eisenhower's fingers drummed on the desk. How do you control a force of nature without breaking it? How do you punish a wolf without losing the hunt? After hours of deliberation, Eisenhower made a decision. He would not order a court-martial. Instead, he would wield a subtler weapon, a private, personal, and direct reprimand. He would write a letter to Patton, one that was honest, cutting, and unavoidable. The letter would hold up a mirror to the general's soul, forcing him to confront his actions without stripping him of his usefulness. Eisenhower dictated the letter himself. Every word was deliberate. I am clearly questioning your judgment, George. I do not expect perfection, but I do expect fairness. Firmness and toughness on the battlefield are necessary, but brutality, abuse of the sick, and uncontrolled temper in front of subordinates cannot be tolerated. He paused, reading over the words. Each sentence was heavy with weight and purpose. This was leadership in its purest form, guiding, correcting, yet preserving the tools needed for victory. He did not demand an apology, yet. He only forced Patton to face the consequences of his actions and realize that his unchecked rage could cost him everything. The letter was entrusted to a special courier. Eisenhower did not trust telegraphs or messages. He needed Patton to hold the paper, see the signature, feel the authority of his command. The letter would travel across the Mediterranean, from Algiers to Sicily, into the hands of the man who could change the fate of the Allied forces in an instant. Meanwhile, in Sicily, Patton went about his duties unaware of the storm about to hit him. He inspected the lines, spoke with officers, and planned attacks. He was a man obsessed with speed, aggression, and glory, completely focused on victory. Yet the letter, once received, would act as a leash on the untamed lion. For the first time, Patton would feel fear, not of bullets, tanks, or artillery, but of losing relevance, losing command, losing the war itself. The tension built across the Allied ranks. Soldiers who had witnessed the slaps held their breath. Rumors had already begun to leak to the press. Journalists whispered of the slapping general, eager for a sensational story. The Allies were walking a tightrope. If the scandal became public, it could shatter morale, divide the nation, and provide propaganda to the Germans. Eisenhower knew this. He had to act quickly, decisively, and with subtlety. His choice was not between right and wrong, it was between disaster and victory. He had to tame the wolf without killing it. He had to teach the man a lesson without destroying his weapon. When Patton finally received the letter, the color drained from his face. For the first time in his life, he was afraid, not of combat, not of the enemy, but of irrelevance. The great general, the unstoppable force, faced the reality that one moment of rage could unravel his career, undo years of strategy, and jeopardize the Allied effort in Europe. Patton read the words, his eyes scanning line after line. Fairness, brutality, temper, accountability. The concepts weighed heavier than any artillery shell he had ever faced. He realized he had gone too far. For the first time, his actions had consequences beyond his control. And yet, the story was far from over. Patton's rage, brilliance and recklessness would not be contained by a letter alone. The events in Sicily were only the beginning, a spark that would ignite a chain reaction affecting soldiers, generals, politicians, and the future of World War II. Inside the tent, the echoes of the second slap still lingered. Soldiers whispered, nurses shivered, and officers exchanged glances that said without words, "This is only the start." Outside, the war raged. The heat, dust, and chaos of Sicily formed the backdrop for a battle not just against the Germans, but against human nature itself. Eisenhower's letter had set the stage, but the question remained: would Patton learn, or would the wolf break free once more? And when he did, what would be the cost, not just to his career but to the fate of Europe itself? The tent, the hospital, and the small tragedies of individual soldiers were minor sparks compared to the firestorm yet to come. But for now, the Allied command held its breath, waiting to see if the greatest American general of the era would survive the consequences of his own fury. After receiving Eisenhower's letter, Patton was furious, but deep down he understood the weight of it. For a man who had lived and thrived on aggression, speed, and glory, this was punishment unlike any other. Not a court-martial, not imprisonment, but humiliation, the slow, grinding type that ate at a man's pride. Patton's orders were clear. He would apologize. Not just to Private Cool or Private Bennett, but to the thousands under his command. Thousands who knew him as old blood and guts, the general who never hesitated to push men to their limits, the man who embodied fear and courage in equal measure. Now he would step into the glaring sun and face them all, not as a god of war but as a man forced to kneel before his own mistakes. The sun burned mercilessly as Patton stood on a raised platform in front of thousands of soldiers. His polished boots, his famous revolvers, even his legendary swagger, none of it mattered now. He cleared his throat, the microphone crackling under the weight of history. The men stared, a mixture of curiosity, disbelief, and suppressed amusement on their faces. Patton spoke. His voice was high-pitched, almost squeaky, a sharp contrast to the booming, furious tone they were used to hearing in battle reports. He didn't apologize for his passion. He didn't say he loved the men less. He explained that his high blood pressure and intensity had led him to act irrationally. He tried to convey that every slap, every moment of rage, was born from a desire to see them survive and succeed, to fight and win. Some soldiers laughed quietly, others gritted their teeth. Many cheered. After all, they wanted victory more than anything. To them, old blood and guts was still their general, flawed but unstoppable. But the seeds of doubt had been planted. Some men whispered, "Is this the same Patton who slapped a soldier for fear? Could a man like this lead us?" Patton's journey did not end on the parade ground. He visited the hospitals where Private Cool and Private Bennett lay. He shook their hands, muttered words of regret, and tried to bridge the gap between brutality and salvation. It was awkward. It was humiliating. For a warrior who thrived on control, this was a bitter pill. Meanwhile, the press in Sicily had been kept at bay by Eisenhower's careful diplomacy. Rumors circulated, but journalists agreed, if the story went public, it could shatter morale and potentially alter the course of the war. For now, the scandal remained secret. But secrets in wartime are like sparks near gasoline. It was only a matter of time before the story would leak. Behind the scenes, Eisenhower watched carefully. He knew he had tamed Patton, but only partially. The wolf had been leashed but not fully trained. Patton's anger, brilliance, and unpredictability were weapons too powerful to waste. The general had been humiliated, yes, but he remained vital. Eisenhower's gamble was working, for now. Yet even as Patton apologized, trained his men, and reassured the soldiers, the shadow of his actions lingered. The slapping incidents were not merely mistakes. They were windows into the mind of a man who loved war more than life itself, a man whose brutality was both terrifying and necessary. He was a paradox, a savior and a tyrant in equal measure. Eisenhower also had to manage the political fallout. Allied governments, wary of public opinion, wanted action. American mothers, hearing whispers from letters and rumors, feared their sons under Patton's command. Soldiers' families worried about their mental state, wondering if bravery could be forced through fear. Eisenhower balanced these pressures, knowing that one wrong move could cripple the coalition. And then came the Germans. Unaware of the apology tour, they received conflicting reports. Was Patton truly punished? Was he still capable of commanding? They assumed deception. In their minds, the slapping scandal was too strategic to be real. Perhaps the Americans were hiding something. Perhaps the general was still preparing for a massive offensive. The Germans hesitated, uncertain. Patton's humiliation had inadvertently created fear on the enemy side. In England, plans for D-Day were progressing. Patton remained a key player, even if sidelined temporarily. His genius as a strategist, his reputation as a fearless commander, and his ability to strike terror into the enemy were too valuable to discard. Eisenhower's careful maneuvering had saved the general, controlled the narrative, and preserved the tool that would one day be crucial to the liberation of Europe. Patton's internal struggle, however, continued. He hated every moment of the apology tour, yet he knew that his survival, the survival of his army and the survival of the war effort, depended on it. Each handshake, each public statement, each visit to the wounded chipped away at his pride, but strengthened the carefully laid plans of Allied command. By the end of August, the storm seemed to pass. Patton had apologized, the soldiers had been pacified, and the rumors suppressed. Yet the general himself remained restless, trapped between humiliation and destiny. The world saw a man forced to bend, but history would soon reveal that the wolf, though leashed, had not lost his fangs. As he sat alone in his quarters, writing to his wife Beatrice, he reflected on the events. The apology, the letters, the secret deal with the press, it was all part of a game larger than him. Patton, a man who thrived on motion, on violence, on glory, had learned the cruel lesson that sometimes survival depended not on speed or strength, but on patience and restraint. And far from Sicily, the seeds of the next chapter were already being planted. The Germans, wary and confused, were making strategic miscalculations. The Allies, guided by Eisenhower's careful hand, prepared for a deception that would later become one of the most ingenious strategies of the war. Patton, though humiliated, was still central to the plan, and the real test of his leadership, the Third Army's march across France, was yet to come. The shadow of the slap remained, the wolf remained leashed, and the world awaited the next move in a game where patience, fury, and strategy collided. After the apology tour, Patton returned to his quarters, but his freedom as a commander was gone. He was not in disgrace yet, but the Allies had placed him under strict orders. He was to keep quiet, avoid public statements, and stay away from frontline decisions. For a man whose life revolved around action, this was a living prison. Patton paced the floor of his villa in England, staring out at the rolling fields, dusted with morning mist. Tanks clanged in the distance, soldiers drilled under the watchful eyes of subordinates, and yet Patton felt invisible. He, the man who had liberated Sicily, who had led men through blood and fire, was now sidelined. His mind, always racing with strategy and bold plans, churned with frustration. But Eisenhower, ever the strategist, had a plan. Patton's removal from command was not the end, it was part of a larger deception. The Germans, believing Patton had been punished and removed, would let down their guard. They assumed the Allies were weakened, and the absence of the notorious old blood and guts would make them careless. So the Allies built the Ghost Army. Patton, though present in England, commanded not men but illusions. Inflatable tanks, fake artillery, empty barracks, and carefully crafted radio chatter were deployed to convince German intelligence that Patton was preparing a massive assault at Pas-de-Calais. Every signal was orchestrated to perfection. Patton, furious and restless, became an actor in a play he did not consent to, yet his very reputation became the weapon that fooled the enemy. Inside the villa, Patton's anger was palpable. He wrote in his diary, "I am a tiger in a cage, forced to watch the world move without me. I should be leading the charge, not playing actor for fools. But the Germans respect my rage, and that may save lives." For the first time in his career, his mind raced not with the thrill of battle but with the frustration of forced patience. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, the Germans observed. They had reports of Patton's slapping scandal, believing him weak, unstable, or disgraced. Their intelligence concluded that the man who once terrified them was now sidelined, a figurehead with no real power. They underestimated him, and that was exactly what Eisenhower and the Allies wanted. The Ghost Army would hold German attention, mislead their forces, and provide the perfect opening for the real invasion. Patton's exile was not just psychological, it was strategic. He could not lead men into battle, but his presence as a symbol of aggression made the Germans hesitate. Every decision he made, every rumor of his activity, created uncertainty on the enemy's side. Patton, the furious and brilliant general, had become a living trap. Despite the frustration, Patton did not remain idle. He trained with officers, studied maps, and refined strategies in private. He prepared, waiting for the moment when he would be unleashed again. His Third Army, though inactive, was ready to strike once the orders came. He mapped out every potential move, calculated every risk and imagined the German responses. The same intelligence and aggression that led him to slap soldiers in Sicily now fueled his preparation for the coming storm. Time dragged. Weeks turned into months. Patton, once defined by action, lived in anticipation. The Normandy invasion approached, and while the Allies launched Operation Overlord, Patton remained in the background, his hands tied by diplomacy and strategy. Yet even in exile, the legend of his wrath and brilliance grew. Soldiers whispered about his return, officers speculated on his maneuvers, and German intelligence, confused and fearful, maintained focus on the wrong location. Patton's personal torment was mirrored by his professional importance. The very man they had almost dismissed for brutality was now central to the success of the D-Day campaign. Eisenhower's gamble was high risk, relying on the reputation of a general who could not be controlled easily. Yet the plan worked. By turning Patton's exile into a psychological weapon, the Allies had created an advantage that would be remembered in military history. Finally, the day arrived when the D-Day invasion loomed. Patton's name, though not on the beaches of Normandy, struck fear into German hearts. He had become a ghost, a legend, a symbol of unstoppable force. The Germans remained uncertain, miscalculating the location and strength of Allied attacks. Every hesitation, every defensive misstep by the enemy, was a direct result of Patton's invisible presence. In his villa, Patton watched the preparations for the invasion unfold. He could not fight yet, but he knew his time would come. The frustration of exile weighed heavily, but he understood its necessity. His anger, once unleashed on soldiers, now fueled a plan to deceive an entire enemy army. Patton, the man who had caused scandal with a slap, was about to prove that even restrained, he was an instrument of war unlike any other. As night fell over England, the quiet was deceptive. The ghost army lay ready, the Germans were deceived, and Patton's mind raced with anticipation. The storm of Normandy was coming, and when it did, the restrained wolf would be unleashed. The world saw a sidelined general, humiliated and caged. But the Allies knew the truth. Sometimes, to save thousands of lives, a wolf must be restrained, but never broken. And Patton, burning with impatience and genius, waited for the day he would strike again. August 1, 1944. The air in England was heavy with anticipation. After months of exile and frustration, Patton was finally given orders to move. The Third Army was ready, and for Patton this was not just a command, it was a release. The wolf had been leashed for too long, and now the cage door opened. Patton's mind was already racing. Maps, terrain, enemy positions. Every detail had been memorized, rehearsed, and imagined countless times. He walked among his staff officers, his eyes sharp, his voice low and commanding. "I don't want to hear about holding positions. We advance. Always advance. The Hun will dig in, let them. We cut through them or we destroy them." The Third Army's mission was clear. Exploit the weakness in the German lines created by Operation Cobra, break through the defenses in Normandy, and drive the enemy back. But to the untrained eye, the operation seemed impossible. The roads were muddy, the weather unpredictable, and the enemy still strong. Yet Patton thrived on the impossible. The German commanders were used to methodical Allied advances, careful tactics, and predictable maneuvers. Patton shattered all expectations. He ordered speed over caution, aggression over hesitation. Tanks rolled like thunder, soldiers advanced with relentless energy, and artillery smashed German defenses with unrelenting precision. Day after day the Third Army moved. 20 miles, 40 miles, 60 miles. The distances that would normally take weeks were conquered in days. Patton ignored supply lines, weather warnings, and conventional strategies. His goal was not just to push back the enemy, it was to crush them, to paralyze their command, and to restore the momentum of the Allied advance. Inside the command tent, officers tried to keep up. Maps were updated frantically. Intelligence officers shouted estimates and warnings. "General, our flanks are exposed." Patton waved them off. "Let the enemy worry about their flanks. I'm going to cut through their guts. That's all that matters." The Germans were terrified. The same man they believed sidelined, humiliated, and weak had returned with a fury they could not comprehend. They expected cautious maneuvers. Instead they faced a whirlwind. Entire divisions were surrounded, towns were captured before Allied headquarters could track their advance, and panic spread through German ranks. Patton's leadership was as much psychological as tactical. His reputation, fueled by both fear and respect, worked like a weapon. Soldiers followed him with relentless energy, inspired by a man who demanded everything and gave nothing less. The Allies gained ground faster than any campaign in modern history. The newspapers in America began to change tone. The scandal of the slapping incidents faded from memory. Maps with giant arrows sweeping across France replaced gossip. Patton's brilliance and sheer audacity became the focus. Mothers who had feared him now thanked him, understanding that his relentless push saved lives by shortening the war and preventing prolonged battles. By December 1944, the Third Army's momentum reached a critical test, the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans launched a massive surprise offensive in the Ardennes, threatening to split the Allied lines and encircle American forces. Panic swept the command. Soldiers feared being trapped, supplies ran low, and the situation teetered on the brink of disaster. Eisenhower called an emergency meeting. Generals smoked nervously, debating strategies. Then he asked Patton the impossible question, "George, how long to hit the German flank?" Patton stood, a calm but terrifying figure amid tension. 48 hours, he said. Laughter broke out, a nervous disbelief. To move a mechanized army of 200,000 men through icy roads and blizzards in 2 days seemed impossible. Yet Patton had already planned it, visualized it, and anticipated every obstacle. And then he moved. Tanks churned through snow, soldiers marched through blizzards, and artillery followed with brutal efficiency. The Germans, expecting delay, were caught off guard. Within 48 hours, Patton struck the flank, breaking the siege of Bastogne, encircling German divisions and turning panic into collapse. When Patton finally rode into Bastogne, he was greeted not by whispers of scandal but by cheers of relief and admiration. The men who had feared his temper in Sicily now celebrated his brilliance. The Third Army's lightning advance had turned the tide, proving that the same ruthlessness that had caused scandal was now the force that saved lives and won battles. Patton's journey from humiliation to redemption was complete, but the shadow of the past lingered. The slapping incidents, once feared to destroy his career, had indirectly contributed to his legend. Soldiers remembered the man who demanded the impossible, who struck fear into both enemy and subordinate, and yet ultimately delivered victory. By the end of 1944, Patton had become unstoppable. The Germans feared him, the Allies relied on him, and history began to take note. Every town liberated, every division defeated, every mile gained reinforced the paradox. Patton's fury, once seen as a flaw, was also his greatest strength. And as he prepared for the final push into Germany, one thing was certain. The war was changing and Patton, the man of action, had returned to shape it. Spring 1945. The war in Europe was reaching its climax. Patton's Third Army had crushed German resistance in France, broken through the Siegfried Line, and driven relentlessly into Germany. Town after town fell under the weight of his aggressive strategy. Soldiers who had once doubted his temper now followed him with absolute trust, inspired by a man who demanded victory at any cost. Yet even as the Allies celebrated victories, Patton remained restless. His mind never stopped racing. Tanks, troop movements, enemy positions, everything consumed him. Victory was never enough. The next challenge always loomed. And yet, in the background, the haunting memory of Sicily lingered. The slapping incidents, once a scandal that threatened his career, had never truly left him. They were a reminder of the fine line he had walked between genius and madness, respect and fear. By May 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. Berlin was surrounded, Hitler dead, and Germany ready to surrender. Patton stood amidst the ruins, surveying the wreckage of cities, burned factories, and shattered roads. He had destroyed the enemy, liberated towns, and freed prisoners. Yet, the war that had defined his life was ending, and peace, a state he never truly understood, was taking its place. In December 1945, the cruelest twist of irony struck. Patton, a man who had survived artillery, machine guns, and the chaos of battle, was taken down by something ordinary, a car accident. Driving through Mannheim, Germany, Patton's Cadillac was hit by a small army truck turning into his path. The impact was not cinematic, no explosion, no sniper, but the result was devastating. Patton was paralyzed, unable to move his limbs, trapped in the very way he had once trapped enemies on the battlefield. In the hospital, surrounded by the machines and tubes that now controlled his body, Patton faced the ultimate vulnerability. The man who had commanded armies, who had charged across France like a force of nature, could not lift a hand. He whispered to his wife Beatrice, "It's too dark, too late." And then silence. The war that had defined him had ended, not in glory, but in the quiet inevitability of fate. Yet Patton's legacy could not be confined to his death. The soldiers he had led remembered him vividly, not the slaps, not the fury, but the relentless drive, the brilliance, and the victories. Private Charles H. Cool, once slapped and humiliated in a Sicilian hospital, survived the war. He returned home quietly, working a modest life in Indiana, carrying the memory of Patton as both terror and salvation. Private Paul Bennett, who had cried in fear under Patton's gaze, survived as well. He returned to Georgia, living with the strange paradox of a man who had struck him in anger yet saved countless lives through the very fury that had frightened him. History remembers Patton as a paradox. He was a bully and a genius, cruel and brilliant, a man of chaos who shaped order on the battlefield. The same hands that struck soldiers were the hands that broke the Wehrmacht, liberated towns, and turned the tide of war in Europe. His flaws were inseparable from his greatness. He had no patience for weakness, yet he saved thousands by pushing men to achieve what they thought impossible. Even Eisenhower, who had once restrained him, understood the truth. Patton was a wolf, dangerous and untamed but necessary. To win, the Allies had needed a man willing to walk the line between fury and brilliance, a man who could be feared by enemies and yet drive victory through relentless action. As the smoke cleared over Europe, the world had to admit an uncomfortable fact. Patton was the right man for the job, even if he was never the right man for comfort or diplomacy. He embodied the chaos of war, the brilliance of strategy, and the ruthless drive for victory. The war ended, but the lessons of his life remained. Greatness often comes with darkness, and history remembers not just the gentle but the relentless. On December 21, 1945, Patton's heart gave out. Surrounded by silence and machines, he whispered one final message to Beatrice: "It's too dark, too late." The lion of the battlefield was gone. The war he had helped win was over, but his legend, paradoxical and complex, would endure. And so, the story of Georges Patton ends not with glory alone, nor shame alone, but with the truth of war itself, messy, violent, and unforgiving. A man both feared and needed, whose fury and genius reshaped the world. The soldiers, the generals, the nations, they all survived and remembered because he had lived as he did, unflinching, unstoppable, and unforgettable. History asks questions, but it rarely offers simple answers. Was Patton a hero or a monster? Perhaps he was both. But one thing is certain: to win a war as vast and brutal as World War II, the Allies needed Georges Patton exactly as he was, brutal, brilliant, and unbreakable. And in the annals of history, the name Patton remains a storm, a paradox, and a lesson. Sometimes to save the world, you need a man unafraid to strike fear, and to strike hard.